Following from the previous episode's analysis of Jesse Lonergan's Hedra and exploring the way comics use space on the physical page for narrative purpose, I wanted to look at Gustavo Borges and Chris Peters' absolutely beautiful comic Petals for a further examination of how we can look at those spatial connects in a more traditional narrative comic. Petals, you may argue, isn't traditional in that it doesn't feature dialogue, but the way the story works in its presentation arguably is. While Hedra was a story built around exploring the way comics kind of work, Petals is an all-ages comic about a fox and a mysterious bird that it meets one day in the woods. It's a story about connection and friendship and love and loss, but it also utilises a lot of similar formal approaches around spatial connections for narrative purpose. So in this episode I want to see how those incredibly interesting explorations of form work in the boundaries of an all-ages comic. You're watching Strip Panel Naked, I'm Hass, and I'm going to show you some of the cool stuff lurking in the pages of some of the best comics. So there's a page really early on where we see this little fox is out collecting wood and it hears a noise from the forest before a strange bird person walks out to see it. This is a really clean and clear sequence and a bit more traditional in its presentation compared to what we looked at with Hedra, as I say. However, it still importantly requires the same fundamental understanding of spatial connections in comics and on the page to work as effectively as it does. So what's happening on this page is 2 points of focus. One is this little fox, and one is this noise that will be revealed to be the bird. Borges establishes space in the scene in the top panel, which stretches the length of the page so that we as readers understand all of that space to be within the same moment, all in that same one image. That its full length is also important and vital to how the sequence works. The fox is placed on the right side, which both creates empty space on the left, but it also physically places it on the right side of the actual page itself. We understand within the world that the fox is off to the right, and that's a kind of weird concept, but from the window we can see into the world, the fox exists on the right side of that window, because Borges places it on the extreme right of the page. That large amount of space on the left side of the panel utilises the dimensions of the page it's placed on, creating this, actual genuine sort of empty space on the left side that you could feel and see physically. The fox is very specifically and very clearly on the right side of this, and because the panel is a full width, it means the fox is also on the right side of the page. And as I write and say this, I feel like I'm making the most obvious point in the world, because as we look at this we can see it on the right side, but it's quite different than a lot of other printed mediums, in that the placement of an object on the page does have an impact on our understanding of where it physically exists in space. So when we look at that second tier, we see the darkness of the forest and the noise the fox hears is on the extreme left side of the page. And suddenly, because of the placement of the fox at the very wide panel at the top, we get a sense of geography within this scene very immediately. Even though Borges hasn't actually drawn anything to show us it, there's no big wide panel here showing where all these characters are in relation to each other. And this is bolstered by the fox in the first panel also looking to the left, and in that large empty space being created, which further cements a spatial connection between those two places on the page, again, even though we're never actually seeing them in relation to each other. I want to do a quick digression just to talk about eye lines within film, because that also is something that comes up here. In film, there's this idea of the 180-degree rule, where a camera is placed on one side of an invisible line in a scene, which means that if you cut back and forth between two characters, as long as you keep that camera on that one side of the line, they're always going to be looking in the right direction. The character on the left is going to be looking to the right, off screen, and the character on the right is going to be looking to the left, off screen. So if you put those two images back to back, you get the impression that even though these two people aren't in the same image, they're both still looking at each other. If you break that line and, say, have both characters looking to the right, even though they're talking to each other, it creates a strange impression that they're not really looking at each other. And a not dissimilar thing happens in comics, but it's additionally complicated by the fact that we can see all of these images at the same time. So if we take this second tier here and we kind of like jumble up the order a little bit of the panels, so that the fox, as it appears in the middle panel, is actually flipped and looking off to the right instead, we don't get the impression anymore that it's looking at the clearing in the trees, which exists on the left side of the page in that first panel. Similarly, if we flip the entire tier, so that the fox is now looking off to the right, but the clearing is also to the right, we now can sort of see and accept that the fox is again looking at that clearing. However, because of the top tier and the spatial connection created in that panel, it now feels like the fox is looking in a different direction than it was in the first panel. It's not necessarily a problem, of course, if that's the intention, but the simple act of changing the direction on the page creates the meaning, because we can see all of those things at once on the same piece of paper. And this is a uniquely comics effect, and a wonderful one at that too, because we have to see everything here on the page at the same time. So if we accept that these spatial underpinnings have a great deal of value in a more traditionally presented narrative comic like this one, we can extrapolate that further and look at how it can become useful directly as a storytelling tool, rather than just a way to create these spatial understandings on the page, but how does it aid the narrative? Petals has one especially good page that showcases this early on, but we can see the beginnings of the effect on this page too. You know, if I draw a line straight down the middle, you can see the two sides of this page here, the fox on the right, bird on the left. We physically see the bird enter the same panel as the fox in the final moment here, but that gulf of space between the two is still very, very visible. The next page has them constantly broken by panel borders here, which keeps the bird again on the left side of the page and the fox on the right side of the page in each of these instances, in the top and final tier. The fox then leads the bird to the house, and we get this just wonderful page where the little fox goes in to check if he's allowed to let the bird person in. And I don't need to draw a line down this page because Borges already has helpfully in the form of the edge of the porch of the house here. So the left and right placement creates this simple spatial effect, as we can pretty much see immediately, understanding that the fox is walking off to the right side of what we're seeing and into the house, while the bird waits on the outside on the left side. But it becomes a narrative tool too, which really helps this emotional moment, because it creates a distance for the bird into the home, and a genuine physical barrier that we can literally see on the page that the bird has to be allowed to cross. We can read this as simply as the bird walks into the house, but what we're also seeing is a connection that's being created between these two characters as the bird is allowed to enter the threshold and into the fox's life. Step from the bird side of the story, which is the left side of the page as has been established, into the fox's side of the story, which is the right side, and into the fox's life. That's a really wonderful and small moment that maybe, pick up immediately, but I think we get the sensation of that kind of understanding of that happening because of the way that the pages have firmly established a left and right divide for the bird and for the fox. If Borges didn't utilise that spatial connection here, for example, and instead just focused on the bird's face waiting as the fox went inside, as I've sort of mocked up here using different panels from elsewhere in the comic, the effect we get as readers is just drastically different. The intent changes, the meaning changes, and therefore the way we as readers engage with it just completely changes. But here, in this way, utilising the left and right sides of the physical page to create that empty space and a physical barrier and a threshold that can get crossed, Borges is using this idea and this spatial connection of comics medium to build narrative value and build story into that, which is just an incredible thing. It's, it's really basic and simple, and I know that when I'm explaining that this seems like a really simple idea, but it is a very interesting case study into thinking about how we can incorporate what can sometimes be thought of as, maybe more sort of experimental comic approaches like what we saw with Hedra into more traditional narratives. But a lot of what Hedra engages with, I think, are things that we do genuinely see in traditional narrative and story-driven comics. I would argue that almost every comic you'll read will utilise spatial connections between characters and panels in ways that may or may not deepen the emotional connection between characters, but it will surely be present. And if I have any power at all to set you any homework after watching this episode, I'd be curious to know in the comments if anyone has noticed any similar, small or large, approaches like this in comics they've been reading that draw directly on the spatial connections between images on the physical page. I think it's way more common than we realise. In the meantime, check out Gustavo Borges' Petals to see how a traditional narrative-driven comic can play with the way images connect on the page to create this deeply emotional and resonant story. And then go check out some other comics and see how they manage to do it too. Thanks for watching. If you're a fan of Strip Pile Naked, you can support the channel via the Patreon, where for your pledge and your support every month you'll get access to literally years and years and years of exclusive writing annotations and reading lists. You should also grab yourself a subscription to Panel by Panel magazine, which is the Eisner-winning magazine that I edit. Otherwise, hit subscribe and the little notification bell to keep up to date with all the latest episodes, and I'll see you next time.